The sun dipped low behind the towering trees, casting elongated shadows across the forest floor. Birds chirped their final songs of the evening as a sleek black luxury car rolled to a stop on a dirt path barely visible from the road. The vehicle's polished frame gleamed briefly in the dying light before the engine was silenced. From the driver's side emerged a tall man in a tailored suit, his posture rigid, his face blank. Everything about him exuded power and precision. The watch on his wrist cost more than most families earned in a year, and the car alone could have bought a small home. He walked around the car to the passenger side and opened the door. Inside sat a small, fragile child, bundled in a soft blanket with a neutral expression on his face. The boy's wide eyes blinked slowly as he looked up at the man who was supposed to protect him. He was 3 years old, born with a neurological condition that made speech impossible and movement difficult. His limbs were stiff, and his hands trembled when he tried to reach for the small plush animal lying next to him. The man hesitated for a brief second, perhaps reconsidering, but the thought was fleeting. He reached in, unfastened the child from the car seat, and lifted him into his arms. The child clung instinctively to the man's jacket, his small fingers curling into the fabric. The man didn't react. He simply walked forward, deeper into the trees, carrying the boy as if he were no more than a package to be delivered. Every step took them farther from the road, the noise of civilization fading into silence. After about 15 minutes, they reached a small clearing overgrown with wild ferns and soft moss, ringed by ancient pines that stood like silent sentinels. He knelt and placed the boy gently on the mossy ground. The child looked up at him, lips parting slightly as if to form a sound. None came. The man placed a small canvas bag beside him. Inside were 2 bottles of water, a few protein bars, and a single thin blanket. No toys, no instructions, no goodbye. He looked at the boy one last time, his face a mask of stone, then stood up and turned around. The boy made a small noise, a breathy half-whimper reaching out with one trembling hand. But the man did not look back. He walked away, slow and deliberate, as if afraid that any haste might break the finality of his decision. By the time he reached the edge of the trees, the last rays of sunlight had vanished. The world was now painted in deep blues and grays, and the temperature was beginning to drop. He climbed back into the car, adjusted his tie, and drove off without a single backward glance. The road swallowed the sound of his engine, and then there was nothing. The boy sat in the clearing, unmoving except for the occasional twitch of his fingers. The forest, alive with nocturnal creatures, gradually closed in around him. Crickets began to chirp, owls hooted in the distance, and unseen animals rustled through the underbrush. A light wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and whisper, secrets the boy could not understand. He did not cry. Perhaps he didn't know how. Back in the city, the man returned to his mansion nestled in an exclusive gated community. He told no one of his actions, not his housekeepers, not his personal assistant, not even his wife, who lived in a separate wing of the estate. She had not seen the boy in weeks and assumed he had been sent to a specialized care facility. That's what the man had told her, an expensive place, far from the city, where the boy would be surrounded by medical professionals. She believed him. He poured himself a glass of aged whiskey and stood at the window, watching the skyline glow with the lights of industry and ambition. He didn't think about the forest. He didn't think about the soft whimper. In his mind, it was done. A necessary evil, he told himself. The boy was defective, a mistake that threatened to tarnish the perfect image he had built. In his world, there was no room for imperfection. Success demanded sacrifice. The next morning, he called a family friend who worked at the local hospital and claimed the boy had succumbed to complications from his illness. A quiet funeral was arranged with a closed casket. No one asked questions. The grieving father played his part well, delivering a short eulogy filled with vague platitudes about suffering and peace. Even a few tears managed to escape his eyes, but whether they were real or not, no one could say. Everyone believed the tragedy. After all, it was easier than questioning the man who seemed to have everything. Meanwhile, the boy remained in the forest. Night turned to day, and the food left for him quickly spoiled. The water ran out. Animals came close, sniffed, and retreated. Hunger gnawed at him, but his legs would not carry him. He lay there for hours, then days, his small body growing weaker, skin paler. But fate, for reasons unknown, did not abandon him. On the fourth day, footsteps approached. An old man, dressed in tattered clothes and carrying a bundle of firewood, stepped into the clearing. He froze when he saw the child, blinking several times to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Slowly, he dropped the wood and hurried forward, kneeling beside the boy. His hands, though rough and calloused, were gentle as he checked the child's pulse and examined his eyes. The boy was barely conscious, lips dry and cracked. The old man didn't ask why a child was alone in the forest. He didn't waste time with questions. He wrapped the boy in his own coat, lifted him with surprising strength, and carried him through the trees toward a hidden cabin nearly a mile away. It was a modest structure, built decades ago and forgotten by most, with a small garden and a hand-dug well. It had no electricity, no modern comforts, but it was safe. Inside, he laid the boy on a cot and began nursing him back to health. Water first, then warm broth made from wild herbs and vegetables. Days passed before the child opened his eyes fully. When he did, the old man smiled. He never asked for the boy's name. He simply began calling him Eli. The forest, which had once threatened to become the boy's grave, was now his home. The man who left him behind returned to his empire, his story of fatherhood complete. But for Eli, a new story was only beginning, one not written in boardrooms or luxury, but in survival, resilience, and an unexpected kind of love. The days that followed in the cabin were filled with silence, yet that silence became a language all its own. Eli lay on the rough cot, his small body slowly gaining strength, surrounded by the earthy scent of pine, smoke from the fireplace, and the musty aroma of the cabin's wooden walls. The old man, who had introduced himself only once as Caleb, moved with a quiet grace. He rarely spoke, but he had a way of humming while he worked, soft melodies with no real tune, just a murmur of notes that seemed to comfort the child more than words ever could. Caleb had once been a carpenter, a craftsman known in the nearby town for his fine furniture, but that was many years ago. Now he lived in isolation, sustained by the garden he grew and the forest he had come to know as intimately as his own heartbeat. It was the forest that had brought Eli to him, and in some strange way, he believed the forest had chosen the boy, perhaps as repayment for years of loyalty, or perhaps simply as a twist of fate. Each morning, Caleb would rise with the sun and tend to the garden. He'd return with fresh vegetables, carrots, potatoes, cabbage, and prepare a simple stew. Eli, though unable to speak, began to respond to these rhythms. He would watch Caleb with wide, curious eyes, and eventually reach for the spoon when food was offered. Slowly, his appetite returned, and with it, a spark of energy. Caleb fashioned a small walking stick out of a birch branch and helped Eli practice, standing, then balancing, then shuffling steps across the creaky floorboards. There were moments of frustration. Eli would whimper when his legs betrayed him, collapsing in a heap of tears. But Caleb was patient. He never rushed the boy. He simply helped him up, dusted him off, and started again. These small victories, unnoticed by the world, were monumental in the cabin. The first time Eli took 3 steps unassisted, Caleb grinned and ruffled his hair. That night, he added a spoonful of wild honey to the boy's porridge as a reward. Though Eli could not speak, he had ways of expressing himself. He laughed, a pure, high-pitched sound, when Caleb made faces while peeling potatoes. He cried when the wind howled too loudly or when the thunderstorm rattled the windows. Caleb began to understand his moods, his cues. When Eli reached for his hand, Caleb knew he wanted to be held. When he pointed toward the trees, it meant he wanted to be taken outside, and so they wandered the forest together. Caleb would carry Eli on his back, showing him the marvels of nature. He taught him the names of the trees by carving simple symbols into bark: pine, maple, oak. He showed him how to recognize animal tracks and explained how to follow the river downstream without getting lost. With every passing week, Eli grew stronger. His steps became more stable, his expressions more confident. The bond between them, though unspoken, was powerful. Caleb began to see Eli not as a burden, but as a blessing. He marveled at the boy's resilience. How could a child so small, so abandoned, still find wonder in the rustle of leaves or joy in the taste of roasted chestnuts? Eli reminded him of what he had forgotten: hope. One evening, as the sun bathed the forest in golden light, Caleb sat whittling by the fireplace while Eli scribbled with charcoal on a piece of birch bark. The boy was drawing trees, tall ones, with wide branches and birds circling above. Caleb looked over and smiled. The child, who had been left to die, was learning to live, but the world beyond the trees had not forgotten Eli entirely. In the city, whispers began to surface. A nurse who had once worked with the Millionaire's family mentioned the child's sudden disappearance to a journalist. A family friend found it odd that there were no photos of the funeral. The mother, increasingly suspicious, began asking questions. Meanwhile, in the forest, Eli was flourishing. Caleb had built a small stool so the boy could sit beside him while he cooked. They planted new crops together in the garden. At night, they sat by the fire, Eli curled up in Caleb's lap, listening to stories told in soft, rumbling tones. Tales of ancient trees, lost villages, and brave little boys who changed the world. Caleb wasn't sure if Eli understood the words, but the boy listened with wide eyes, absorbing every syllable. One day, Caleb decided it was time to go into town. Supplies were running low and he needed medicine for his joints. He debated taking Eli with him, but feared the boy might draw attention. Instead, he instructed Eli carefully, pointing to the door, the food supplies, the firewood, miming actions the boy had seen 100 times. Eli nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting both trust and worry. Caleb left before sunrise, his heart heavy. The town was nearly 2 hours away by foot. He moved quickly, hoping to return before dusk. He avoided the main roads, traveling through paths only he knew. In town, he purchased flour, salt, and a few essentials. At the pharmacy, he picked up balm for his knees. He spoke little, kept his head down, and left quickly. Back in the forest, Eli waited. He sat by the window for hours, watching the trees sway. When a squirrel appeared at the window ledge, he offered it a piece of dried apple. When the wind picked up and the shadows grew long, he curled up in Caleb's chair, hugging his plush. Caleb returned just as night fell, exhausted but relieved. Eli ran to him, his steps fast and sure, and threw his arms around his waist. Caleb knelt and embraced him, the weight of loneliness lifting from them both. That night, they shared a feast of roasted vegetables and bread. Caleb whispered, "You did good, little man." Eli beamed, but change was coming. A drone from a nearby land survey, a government project mapping forest areas, flew overhead weeks later. It captured an image of the cabin. No one had lived there officially for decades, yet the photo showed signs of habitation. Authorities took note, and among the faces analyzing those photos was a woman who had once searched for her son. The forest had kept Eli safe, but the outside world was inching closer. Caleb sensed it too. He grew more watchful, more protective. He started teaching Eli how to hide, how to recognize danger. He buried their food stores deeper and created escape routes. Yet he knew, deep down, that this fragile world they had built could not remain untouched forever. Still, he hoped. He hoped the world would forget. He hoped the forest would shelter them a little longer. For now, Eli was safe. He was loved. And that, Caleb believed, was enough. What neither of them could see was that fate was stirring once more. Somewhere, a file was being opened, a photo was being examined, and a mother long silenced was about to reclaim her voice. The morning was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The usual bird song that greeted the sunrise was absent, and the air held a stillness that seemed to press against the windows of the small cabin. Caleb noticed it the moment he stirred from his bed. He looked toward the hearth, where the fire had burned low during the night, its embers glowing faintly. Eli was still asleep, curled under a patchwork blanket, his breathing soft and even. Caleb rubbed his aching knees and stood slowly. The silence unsettled him. Years of living in the forest had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they screamed that something was amiss. He stepped outside and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No rustle of squirrels, no flutter of wings. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He moved with caution throughout the day, chopping wood only near the cabin, avoiding the deeper trails. Eli seemed to sense the tension too. He stayed close to Caleb, not venturing toward the stream as he usually did. That evening they ate in silence, each bite of stew a comfort, a ritual. After Eli was asleep, Caleb sat in his old chair and stared into the fire, remembering a time when silence had meant peace. Now it felt like a warning. Several days passed before the silence broke, and when it did, it shattered everything. A knock on the cabin door came just after dawn. Caleb froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. Eli looked up, confused. There had never been a knock before. Caleb rose, heart pounding, and opened the door slowly. Two men stood there, one in a ranger's uniform, the other in a dark suit. Behind them a drone hovered, whirring quietly. The suited man spoke first. "Mr. Caleb Branner?" Caleb didn't answer. "We're here on behalf of the Department of Child Welfare and Law Enforcement. May we come in?" Caleb glanced back at Eli, who had now risen to his feet, his hands trembling slightly. The boy recognized the danger, even if he didn't understand the words. The ranger stepped forward. "We're not here to arrest anyone. We just need to understand what's going on." Caleb opened the door fully. The men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the interior. It was clean, simple, lived in. Eli stood silently near the hearth, eyes locked on Caleb. The suited man pulled out a photograph and showed it to Caleb. It was a picture of a much younger Eli, barely recognizable. "Is this the boy?" Caleb nodded slowly. "We believe he is the son of Robert Alcott, the millionaire who reported him deceased nearly 30 years ago." Caleb's heart sank. The name was unfamiliar to him, but the implication was clear. The ranger crouched beside Eli and smiled gently. "Hey there, buddy. You okay?" Eli didn't respond. He looked at Caleb, eyes wide with fear. The ranger stood. "We're going to need to take him in for some tests, medical, DNA. This could be the breakthrough we've been looking for." Caleb's voice cracked. "You're taking him?" "It's just temporary," the man in the suit said. "You've clearly cared for him well, but the law requires an investigation." Eli began to cry, a silent, heart-wrenching sob that made the ranger's face tighten. Within the hour, they were gone. Eli had been strapped into the back of a government SUV, his hand pressed against the window, reaching for Caleb as the cabin faded behind him. Caleb stood motionless, watching the vehicle disappear down the trail. He didn't cry. Not yet. The next few weeks blurred into a haze of bureaucratic procedures and media frenzy. Once the DNA confirmed Eli's identity, the story exploded across national headlines. Abandoned heir found alive in forest after 30 years. The public was outraged. Investigations were launched. Robert Alcott, long believed to be a grieving father, was arrested on charges of child abandonment, fraud, and obstruction of justice. His empire crumbled overnight, and in the middle of it, all stood Eli, a man now, though still silent, still unable to speak. He sat through interviews and evaluations, always surrounded by strangers in suits and lab coats. He missed the trees, the firelight. Caleb. The world was eager to label him. Miracle child. Forest boy. Lost heir. But to Eli, he was simply Eli. The child who once could not walk now stood tall. But inside, the same quiet heart beat with confusion and longing. Eventually, a woman came. Her name was Helen Alcott. His mother, she, had never stopped searching. After her husband told her the boy had died, she mourned. But something had always felt wrong. She hired private investigators, filed FOIA requests, followed every rumor. Her search had led nowhere, until now. The reunion was tentative. Helen cried when she saw Eli. She reached for him, but he hesitated. She was a stranger. Still, something in her touch, her eyes, reminded him of warmth. He let her hold his hand. Caleb, meanwhile, remained in the cabin. The media tried to find him, but he vanished into the deeper woods, beyond where any drone could see. He had given Eli everything he had, and now it was time to let the boy go. A court ruled in favor of shared guardianship. Helen would be Eli's legal guardian, but Caleb was recognized as his caregiver and protector. He was not punished. Public sentiment had turned in his favor. They called him a hero. A man who saved a life, not stole one. Eli moved into a quiet estate with Helen. It was far from the city, surrounded by hills and meadows. But every month they visited the forest. Not the cabin, Caleb had abandoned it, but a nearby clearing, where Eli and Caleb would sometimes meet, sit together, and share a quiet hour. In time, Eli began to paint. His first piece was a forest in autumn, filled with golden leaves and a small boy in the center, holding hands with a tall old man. The world finally heard his voice, not through speech but through art, and they listened. The story of the abandoned child had not ended in tragedy. It had bloomed into something rare and beautiful, a testament to resilience, to unexpected love, and to the idea that sometimes family isn't who you're born to, but who stays when everyone else walks away.